In this second video, I'll give you an overview of George Washington, the man. And you've, of course, if you've seen the previous videos, you already know a lot about him. But I'll also give you an overview of his presidency. Washington was the first of the 6 children of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. He also had 3 half-siblings from Augustine's first marriage. When Augustine, a justice of the peace, died in 1743, Washington inherited his boyhood home, Ferry Farm, near what today is Fredericksburg, Virginia. He also inherited 10 slaves, I should note. Growing up, he frequently visited his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, at the estate Lawrence had inherited from their father, which Lawrence had named Mount Vernon, which was near Alexandria, Virginia. Lawrence was almost 15 years older than George, but the two became quite close. I should note that Washington had a sort of a strained relationship with his mother. His mother was very demanding and not very, not easily impressed with all Washington's accomplishments. The young Washington also frequently visited Belvoir, the wealthy estate of William Fairfax, Lawrence's father-in-law, the father of Lawrence's wife. William Fairfax became almost a surrogate father to Washington, and after Washington trained as a surveyor, William Fairfax named him the official surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, which was then on the frontier. You can see where Culpeper County is today in the map on the right. Washington made frequent visits to the frontier and bought land there. In 1751, Washington made his only trip abroad when he accompanied Lawrence on a trip to Barbados. Washington also became good friends with William Fairfax's son, George William Fairfax, who was, Lawrence's brother-in-law. When George William Fairfax married the wealthy Sally Carey, Washington befriended her as well. George William Fairfax eventually inherited Belvoir and remained one of Washington's friends. Today, the whole area around there is known as Fairfax County, by the way, if you're familiar with Washington. Now, there is evidence, however, that Washington loved Sally Fairfax, and may have even had an affair with her, an affair with one of his best friend's wife. Inspired by his brother Lawrence's service in the Virginia militia, George volunteered as well and was sent to the frontier to warn the French that they were encroaching on English land. It was the beginning of a military career that led Washington to become president. When Lawrence died in 1752, Washington inherited his estate and Mount Vernon. Washington served in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War, fighting on the frontier. He knew the frontier, and earning promotions and a command. He was, however, denied a commission in the regular British Army. Imagine if he'd gotten that commission. I wonder if history would have been changed. He emerged from the war a respected veteran and a wealthy landowner. In 1759, at the age of 26, Washington married the even wealthier widow Martha Custis, who was 28 and already had 2 children. Washington raised the 2 with Martha and later their grandchildren, but he and Martha never had children of their own. Now controlling his wife's 18,000-acre estate and 84 slaves, as well as his own property and slaves, Washington had become one of Virginia's wealthiest planters and most prominent citizens. You can see a picture of Martha Washington as a young woman when Washington married her on the left, and as the more famous First Lady on the right. Given his wealth and prominence, Washington served in the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, and represented the state at the Continental Congress, where he was selected, as you know, if you've seen previous videos, to lead the new Continental Army in the American Revolution. Washington remained a planter, expanding and improving Mount Vernon. You can see Mount Vernon here on the left. And he always maintained Mount Vernon as his home. And on the right, he is shown in his military uniform. The first constitutional election, held in 1788, just after the ratification of the Constitution, elected George Washington, who'd been reluctant to re-enter public life after the Revolution, but whom all agreed was the best candidate. The only contention was over who would serve as vice president. If you look at this map, you can see like places like New York and North Carolina is black. How did they vote? Well, Several states like those two, they didn't vote because they had not appointed electors or had yet to ratify the Constitution. Now, according to the Constitution at the time, all electors cast two votes. The one who won the most would become president, and the second place finisher would become vice president. Washington won a vote from every elector, and thus his election is considered unanimous. John Adams from Massachusetts ended up with 34 votes, the second place finisher, and became vice president. I should add that the 12th Amendment, we'll talk about later on, would change this process for electing the president and vice president. Washington took the oath of office in early 1789 in New York City's Federal Hall. That had originally been like the city council building in New York. It had been the location of the Stamp Act Congress. Washington took the oath of office as required by the Constitution on the balcony of that building, and he put his hand on a Bible, and that of course has become a precedent that every president's followed. For his first 2 years, Washington and Congress governed from New York City. Congress met in Federal Hall, which I was just describing, but Federal Hall doesn't exist today. If it did, it would be located then to Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. Anyway, in 1790, the capital was moved to Philadelphia, where it was agreed that it would be the capital city temporarily during construction of a new capital city. You can see on the bottom left the New York City's Federal Hall, and in Philadelphia where it met in Congress Hall, they called it, on the right here. And we'll talk more about the movement of the formation of the federal capital city later on. When Washington was president living in New York City, those first 2 years, he lived in what they call the President's House, which was on Cherry Street in Lower Manhattan. You can see the historical mark on the left that's up there today. And then when the capital moved to Philadelphia until the end of his presidency, he lived in the house you can see on the bottom right that was on Market Street in Philadelphia. I should note that Washington agreed to seek another term in 1792, and he won this re-election unanimously in that vote as well. Among of Washington's appointments, his cabinet, were the leaders of the two emergent political parties. Washington is going to try to remain above the emergent growth of political parties, try to hold the country together, a feared faction. So what he did was he named Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic Republicans, as his Secretary of State, and he named Alexander Hamilton, the leader of the emergent Federalists, as his Secretary of Treasury. He also named the Revolutionary War veteran Henry Knox as Secretary of War. I should note in regard to Hamilton, he first appointed Roger Morse, but Roger Morse declined. He wanted to make more money than what the salary was. So Morse then recommended Hamilton. Washington's salary as president was pretty substantial, $25,000. Vice President Adams was $5,000. Washington decided he wouldn't run again in 1796. 2 terms were enough for him. He wanted to return to Mount Vernon. His 2 terms would then serve as a precedent that other presidents followed for years. Now, as he departed, Washington set another precedent when he gave a famous farewell address, and you can see it on the right here. In that farewell address, he warned the country to avoid foreign entanglements. Don't get involved in other countries' wars. Washington died in December, on December 14th, 1799 in Mount Vernon after suffocating from a throat infection. It's kind of a sorry tale. He had a cold and he caught it in his throat swelled up and he couldn't breathe. And they called in the doctors, and some of the doctors had just been back from a medical school in France, and they wanted to try something called a tracheotomy, cut into his windpipe. But then the doctors that hadn't been there feared, I'm not cutting into the George Washington's windpipe, and so they just wanted to bleed him. And of course, had they had that tracheotomy, Washington might have survived. But in any event, the nation mourned, and Washington's reputation as the, quote, father of our country, unquote, grew. If you go to Mount Vernon today, you can see his tomb, which is shown here. He's buried next to his wife Martha in that tomb. In any event, this concludes the second video on the Federalist era, sort of an overview of Washington, the man, and his presidency.